Hello, my name is Anne Martel. I'm from Sunnybrook Research Institute in Toronto, and I'm one of the program co-chairs for MICCAI 2020. So I'd like to thank the organisers of the hackathon for giving me this opportunity to explain how we put together the MICCAI scientific program for this year. In particular, this will be a guide to the reviewing process and program organisation for MICCAI 2020. So in the hackathon, a number of questions have been raised. First of all, is MICCAI diverse enough? So have we got diversity in our review team, in the authors and in the science? Then the hackathon also poses the question, how can we improve the process? And finally asks, what defines a good paper? Now these questions are all for people to discuss, so I decided for the purposes of this talk, I'd simply provide the data. So how did we select the team, review the papers, select the papers and create a virtual conference in 2020? And hopefully by providing this data, I can help inform you in your discussions to answer the hackathon questions. So the first step in any conference is obviously selecting the team, and this is a crucially important step. The quality of the whole process will depend on the top organisation, scientific chairs and general chairs, workshop chairs and so on, but it'll also depend on the quality of the area chairs and the reviewers. So I'm going to go through that process one step at a time. So a MICCAI conference starts with a bid to the board, and this is usually made 3, 4, even 5 years before the conference takes place. So as well as having a cool location and an exciting team put together, diversity is a key element when the bids are being assessed. So the first element is geographic diversity. And traditionally, MICCAI rotates between the Americas, Europe and Africa, and Asia and Oceania. So the diversity of actual locations for the conference is built in. But now it's also expected that there'll be geographical diversity in the organisational team. So even if a conference is being organised in Europe, it's often hoped that the conference team will have a little bit more diversity geographically than that. Gender diversity is essential. The expectation is that the senior team, and this is the general programme and workshop chairs, will be gender balanced. And for several years now, this has certainly been the case. And finally, very important is scientific diversity. We need to have a balance between the MEEC and the CHI communities. The CHI community used to be much larger in MICCAI and has been shrinking of late, but it's still very important to ensure that those people representing CHI are assessed in terms that are relevant to them and that there's a diverse representation on the committee. The vision of a bid is also important. MICCAI 2020 was planned as the first Latin American conference with a goal of growing the Latin American community in MICCAI. Daniel and Leo are still very committed to this goal, even though we're unfortunately not able to present this meeting in Peru as planned originally. So we have the CPIM meeting appended to MICCAI. We also tried to make sure that we had a very strong representation from Latin America. So these are the program chairs for 2020. You can see that we succeeded in being gender balanced. We also have a good mix of MEEC and CHI and a good geographical diversity. Diana and Maria also have strong Latin American connections, although they are both based in Europe now. So moving on to the selection of the area chairs. This is a particularly important part of the process. Area chairs should be senior members of the MICCAI community, and they have a strong influence on the review process. So it's very important that they have sufficient scientific expertise in a diverse range of topics that will be submitted to the conference. We also need to have enough area chairs with the right kind of expertise. So several years ago, when the deep learning boom started, the program committee had to scramble to recruit enough area chairs. So we have to predict a little bit about what the future demand will be. The area chairs also have an influence in guiding the culture of the conference. They can use their experience to differentiate between impactful and incremental research. And they probably have a better idea of what's clinically relevant and what isn't relevant, or what is incremental and what isn't, compared to more junior researchers. So it's really important that we get a good selection of area chairs, but of course we need to ensure diversity at this stage as well. So applications for area chairs was done by a web application form, and we took a little bit of care to try and make this more welcoming to underrepresented groups. So we added a section down the bottom here that said we strongly encourage applications from women and other represented communities and regions. And we also removed the requirement for 6 MICCAI papers. So originally it was asked for 6 MICCAI papers, of which we were a senior author in 3. This tends to discriminate against people who don't belong to large groups and therefore don't often get invited to be co-authors on MICCAI papers. So we ended up, as a result of this process, with 82 area chairs. We made special efforts to reach out to more female applicants, Latin American applicants and CHI candidates, because in our original application pool, these groups were very underrepresented. We ended up with 26% female area chairs, 74% male. 10% of the applicants were CHI, but we accepted 14% of CHI in the final pool. The number of Asian applicants for the program committee was actually quite high. We had 26% of the original applicants were from Asia. We only ended up accepting 18%, partly because they tended to have less MICCAI experience. So as well as trying to balance geographical diversity and gender diversity, we also wanted to make sure we had a good mix of experienced and inexperienced program chairs. We managed to recruit 5% Latin American chairs, and this was done by some extensive outreach by members of the program committee. So the next step is the reviewer selection. This again was done by a web form and fairly aggressive emailing of the community to try and get people to sign up. We knew we were going to have almost 2,000 submitted papers, so we needed a large reviewer pool to cope with this demand. In the end, we recruited about 1,500 reviewers. There were several reviewers recruited as emergency last-minute reviewers after the initial batch were recruited. The 6 program chairs reviewed all applications. This was a bit of a Herculean task, but we used experience as the main criteria. We had to manually check the information provided in the web form, as data from applicants tended to be somewhat unreliable. What people decided counted as a previous publication or paper tended to vary very greatly, so we did have to do quite a bit of quality control on that. We weren't able to try and balance representation. There's simply too many reviewers that we needed to recruit to spend the time doing that. And we recruited in several different batches, so I haven't got statistics on the whole 1,400 cohort, but I do have statistics from the initial batch of 750 reviewers. So 20% of the applicants were female, 26% of the accepted reviewers were female, and again 10% were CHI and about 14% of the accepted reviewers were CHI. So once we've recruited our area chairs and reviewers, we have to set up the process for assigning papers to them. First part in this step is for the reviewers and area chairs to upload about 5 or 6 representative papers to the Toronto paper matching system. This system then matches the papers uploaded with the submitted paper and assigns a score to that paper, to the reviewer and the paper. And some of that data has actually been uploaded for the hackathon so that you can have a look at it. The reviewers also specify how many papers they're willing to review, up to a maximum of about 5. We try and keep the number of papers per reviewers down to a small number to ensure that they have time to do a good quality job. The reviewers and area chairs also upload keywords to the conference management system. This list of keywords has been specified in advance and is usually modified year to year. So we updated the keywords we used again. It's actually very difficult to get a representative set of keywords that are easy for reviewers and authors to assign to their papers. The reviewers also upload web links to CMT, so we need to have something like a Google Scholar link or a departmental web page link so that the area chairs can look up a reviewer's web page and understand better what their expertise is. After the papers have been submitted, we allocate these to area chairs, and we do this directly with the TPMS. So each area chair ended up with a stack of about 23 papers based on the TPMS match. The area chairs then use the TPMS and relevance scores to select about 9 reviewers per paper, and I'll go through these steps in more detail in a minute. Reviewers bid on the papers they want to review, and then a complex optimization process follows. The CMT process allows reviewers to bid on which papers they want to review. But clearly we can't expect reviewers to look through all 1,800 submissions and decide which ones they're interested in. So what happens is the area chairs are asked to select and rank something like 9 or more reviewers per paper, and each area chair has 23 or so papers in their stack. By default, the area chairs are shown the reviewers in TPMS rank order. So the first reviewer on their list is usually the one with the highest TPMS score. But they can reorder the reviewers based on relevance score. The relevance score is based on the keywords that have been provided. And they can also go to the Google Scholar webpage to find out more about the reviewers, or they may actually also know of particular people in the reviewer pool who would be perfect for reviewing a particular paper, and they're free to choose those, whatever the scores are. This graph here shows you the area chair's ranking score versus the TPMS score. And you can see it's certainly not a completely correlated relationship. So papers along here have got a high TPMS score, and they tend to have a lower area chair rank. So lower area chair rank means a better match, higher area chair rank means a poorer match. So you would expect the graph to go in a diagonal this way. You can see it's a much more complicated relationship than that. And if we actually look at the TPMS score against the bids from the reviewers, you can see again that there's not a clear relationship between the TPMS score and the reviewers' bids, or between the area chair rank and the reviewers' bids. So once the area chairs have selected a list of 9 or more reviewers per paper, the reviewers are then asked to bid on the papers. So once the bidding step is complete, the CMT tries to optimize the allocation of papers using a cost function. The cost function is made up of a weighted sum of the following terms. So the bids are from the reviewers. The suggestions from the area chair rank also plays a part, as does the subject area relevance based on the keywords, and the TPMS ranking, I think it is, rather than the score actually. So you can weight these any way you like. So what is shown here are the weights we ended up using. We found that we needed to weight the bids quite strongly, otherwise we tended to get papers assigned to reviewers who'd actually specifically said that they did not want to review a particular paper. So we had to crank this one up quite high, and then we fiddled around with these until things looked reasonable. It also takes into account domain conflicts and quotas, which is an important aspect of assigning reviewers. Despite the fact that TPMS scores are fairly highly regarded, many papers declined papers even though they had a good TPMS-based match. So you can see here, this graph here shows you the TPMS score and against papers were assigned or not assigned. So you can see when they have actually been assigned, you can see that some papers, even though they've got a very, very poor TPMS score, they actually have been assigned to a particular reviewer. We had to go through the CMT recommendations and actually reassign papers. So many of the assignments did go to reviewers who were willing or eager, so that's a score of 2 or 3. But many went to unwilling reviewers. So Kitty, Parang and I had to go through manually and actually reassign these papers. So in this graph here, you can see what the bids were eventually on the assigned papers. So most of the papers that we assigned, as I say, had either willing or eager bids. We had some in a pinch. We took out all of the unwilling ones, and we ended up with about 700 or so who hadn't bid on a paper being allocated. So a reviewer can only bid on a paper if the area chair has put them in the ranked list. So in some cases we had papers where we needed to go into reviewers who hadn't yet bid on it. So for those cases we checked to see whether the TPMS rank was within reasonable limits. So TPMS rank of 1,000 sounds like a very poor match, but in actual fact the TPMS scores have a somewhat flat distribution. We also checked the relevance score to see whether it was reasonable or not. If these things didn't pan out, then we manually checked the quality of the match. So there are several areas of improvement on the current system. There's no easy way at the moment of ensuring a distribution of expertise amongst reviewers. So we can't try and allocate one senior reviewer, one mid-career reviewer and one junior PhD student reviewer to a paper. We just have to go with what the CMT says. We can't check on the diversity of reviewers, so we could end up with a situation where 2 or 3 reviewers actually come from the same research group, which is clearly not a good idea. It doesn't at the moment give us a hard block to say do not allocate a paper to someone who's actually said they're unwilling to review it. Now we have to try and maximize the enthusiasm of the reviewers for any given paper, because we need to get 3 reviews on over 1,800 papers done in just a very short period of time. So we really need to have people who want to do the job. It relies heavily on reviewers uploading TPMS information, and Kitty Wong, the platform manager, had to spend a lot of time chasing up reviewers to get them to upload this information to the system. A lot of tuning of parameters was needed. We had to go through many runs to figure out what the best weightings were for the different factors. And the TPMS scores themselves correlate poorly with the willingness of viewers, as do the area chair ranks, as do the relevance scores. So that's why in the end we went with basically taking the willingness of the reviewers as the primary factor in assigning papers. So we've now selected the reviewers, we've sent them out the papers. Before we send out the papers, there was an initial quality control check carried out by the programme committee chairs. So first of all, we rejected papers with gross violations of anonymity. So these were really ridiculous violations of anonymity, that the author had basically left their names and affiliations at the top of the paper, despite many instructions saying, don't do this. We tended to let slips through where they were more subtle. So if somebody had put down the data has come from a hospital X, and that was in their area, we tended to let that one go, partly because papers could actually be on archive. So we didn't want to be too strict on the anonymization. We also rejected papers with gross violations of formatting. This was actually quite difficult to decide what the cutoff line was, and this wasted many, many days of our time doing this. So it's actually an area we need to look at in the future. We used Authenticate, which is an online system to check for duplicate submissions. This is to avoid the situation where somebody has submitted exactly the same paper to multiple conferences. All of this quality control check is a rather subjective and time-consuming process. And as I say, the acceptance of preprints in archive tends to alter the calculus a little bit. So if somebody can actually upload a fully identifiable paper in archive, which could be easily found by the reviewers if they do a search on some of the keywords, then we shouldn't really be rejecting papers that have inadvertently let something slip. It can be quite difficult for authors to understand how to make something completely anonymous. Also, the move to electronic proceedings may remove some of the length constraints in future, so maybe we should be a little bit more flexible on violations in formatting as well, and we certainly need a better way of identifying those. So we spent a lot of time as a committee improving the instructions to the reviewers. So we wanted to make it very clear how we expected the reviews to go on. We wanted to give good quality information to the reviewers. So all of the data is actually on this website here. It included a general guide to good reviewing practices. So lots of instructions about make the reviews constructive, make them specific, make them informative. We also spent a lot of time trying to write specific guidelines for MICCAI and MICCAI papers, and Terry Peters had done a lot of work on this last year, so we tried to follow on from that work. So for MICCAI, the key questions are the proposed methods innovative, or is the application innovative? And it's a really hard problem to try and weed out the papers that are actually going to have an impact from the papers that are just purely incremental. So a paper may not actually provide better results, but it may be so innovative in the approach it takes that it will have a major impact in the future. We don't know. It may be that the paper simply reduces something to practice in such an effective way that it has a major impact. For CHI, the demonstration of system integration and phantom or clinical validation are very important. So is clinical significance. And also the numbers of test cases tend to be very different in these two groups. So for a MICCAI paper, you tend to expect multiple data sets, large data sets, but for CHI, it may be a huge effort just to get a patient cohort of, say, 20 to actually test something in the operating theatre. So these two areas do tend to have different reviewing criteria. Scoring scales are always a subject of debate and controversy, and we did have a debate about this in one of the telephone conferences we had with all the area chairs before we started the review process. We did have separate questions on the forms to fill in for the reviewers to talk about scientific innovation and contribution to clinical translation. So this was supposed to help inform the area chairs as to where the key contribution of the paper lay. For the overall score, we elected to use a scale adapted for NeurIPS. So this had descriptive terms and a 10-point scale, which led to very well calibrated scores. So the score of 5 says it's on the acceptance threshold, slightly below, and number 6 is slightly above the acceptance threshold. In actual fact, the cut point for acceptance lay somewhere between these on average. We did end up with some complaints about the wording of it. I think I am surprised this work was submitted to MICCAI as strong reject. It was thought to be too harsh, so I believe that next year's programme committee are already looking at reviewing the wording on this to make it more appropriate. But I feel like it certainly helped to have very clear descriptions of the score, and it did seem to make things more reproducible. So the area chair's job is to monitor the reviews, contact the reviewers if the standard is poor, and then after the reviews are in, the area chairs read all the reviews and score as early reject, early accept or rebuttal. And they're also expected to provide a meta review. We were aiming for 15% early accept, 50% early reject, and 35% rebuttal. We need to keep these rebuttal numbers down somewhat because it produces an extra burden on the area chairs and also adds extra delay into the system. The programme committee members, the programme chairs rather, we carried out quality control checks on the meta reviews, and we asked the area chairs to expand if we felt that insufficient detail was provided. The programme chairs also reviewed all of the decisions. So we looked for papers that had a very wide variance in scores, and we also looked at papers where the average score was discordant with area chair's decision. So some papers had some moderate enthusiasm by reviewers, but the area chairs had flat out rejected them. And in a few cases, area chairs had just done a straight accept when the reviewers were much less enthusiastic about the paper. So we did actually go over these and check on all these borderline cases, which is why the number of papers that went into rebuttal actually went up. Anything we were in doubt in, we gave the authors a chance for a rebuttal. So after the papers come back from rebuttal, we recruit 2 additional area chairs per paper. So we now have three area chairs looking at a paper, and the final decision was made by a simple majority vote. Unfortunately, that gave us the 30% acceptance that we were looking for. So this summarizes the whole review process. We had almost 3,000 notifications of intent, which went down to 1,876 submissions, slightly more than last year, which we were expecting a drop from last year because last year's conference was in China, or this year's was supposed to be in Peru, so we were expecting a smaller number, but that didn't happen in the end. We reviewed 1,809, so just rejected some of these. And then these are the numbers that go for accept, rebuttal, and early reject. So we ended up with 542 papers at the end. This is a breakdown of the accepted papers by subject heading. So these are either the primary subject heading, or if there's only a small number of those papers, I've reassigned the secondary heading. So you can see that the majority of the papers are in segmentation as usual. Computer-aided diagnosis has got a very large number of submissions. Machine learning theory is only 51 papers accepted, but actually most of these other categories use some kind of deep learning or machine learning in them. You can see the percentage of papers in each category accepted here. So you can see that a larger portion of papers that fell into the image-guided intervention, surgery, these are most of the CHI papers in here. So they have a rather higher than 30% acceptance rate. Some other categories have a lower acceptance rate. So you can see that the other categories, only 26%. In actual fact, we did find that papers that fell outside of the traditional MICCAI areas did have a higher tendency to be rejected, partly because no one quite knew how to review them, which is a problem we need to look at in the future. Similarly, this is the breakdown of MICCAI and CHI, so we have a pretty good balance of accepted papers here. We checked the gender distribution of the accepted papers. Now, papers are anonymized during the review process, so we wouldn't expect to see any bias in terms of gender, and we didn't seem to see any when we looked at the results. So 19% of submitted papers were from women, and 19% of accepted papers were from women, so no change there. Similarly with the demographics, we seem to maintain pretty much the same demographics. A slightly lower acceptance rate for papers from Asia. This may reflect just a much higher submission rate from more inexperienced authors. And you can see that PhD students actually have a slightly higher chance of getting their paper accepted than other groups, which is, I guess, what you would hope for, really, since they drive most of the research in this area. So I want to finish off this talk by saying a few words about how we converted to a virtual conference. So obviously this is a major change in the way we have our MICCAI conferences. We're very used to the standard system where we have plenary sessions, or at most just 2 parallel oral sessions, coupled with the poster part of the conference, which has always been the main backbone of a MICCAI conference. So I went to several virtual conferences before MICCAI was due to take place. ICLR and Middle were 2 particularly good examples, in order to try and get some idea of what was working and what wasn't. So the first thing that's obvious from all of these is it's essential to have talks uploaded and an ability to post questions online. And this is really essential if you've got people in different time zones. It's very, very difficult for someone from China to meet online with somebody from North America. The time zones are just too different. I found that the poster Zoom sessions were very bearable. So I'm defining a poster Zoom session here as one where the author is on a Zoom channel and then people can just drop onto that Zoom channel as they want and ask questions. So some authors at the conferences I went to had a lot of traffic and found the experience very beneficial. It was basically no different to chatting to somebody in person about their research. So it was an excellent experience for them. But other poster presenters found that they had virtually nobody visiting them. And it was also quite intimidating for attendees. So somebody would drop in onto a poster session and suddenly find that they were face to face with the author. Now, if you do this in person, you can lurk by a poster. So if you're new to the area, you just want to learn a little bit, it's quite nice to be able to sort of stand near a poster and listen to the discussion between the author and other attendees who might be more knowledgeable. The online system tended not to allow this to happen because you couldn't usually see who was online at a given time. I also noticed that even when oral presentations tended to be pre-recorded, but often the conferences would allow a short 1 or 2 minutes Q&A after each oral presentation. That tended not to be very useful. Usually the online platforms make it difficult to pose questions. People tend to be quite shy. There didn't seem to be much interaction going on during these oral sessions. Keynotes were accepted. So keynotes, you've got an exciting keynote speaker, everybody's attending the lecture, there's lots of interest and lots of questions are being posted online, but not so much for the standard oral presentations. But I went to some workshops as part of ICLR and found that moderated panel discussions did seem to be more successful. So you'd collect a bunch of authors together, you've got a couple of chairs and ask them questions, and that seemed to work quite well as a format. So for MICCAI, what we've decided to do is instead of having a small number of oral sessions, we have a large number of mini oral sessions. So this removes the selection process. Basically, everybody is part of a mini oral session. So this means that papers need to be grouped into thematic clusters. So if we're going to have some kind of mini panel discussion, we have to have some similarity between the papers. So I tried to learn some NLP and generated some feature vectors using a transformer. And then I tried to apply some hierarchical clustering to group similar papers. This seemed to work pretty well, but then a lot of manual corrections were needed to make the sessions in approximately the same size. I needed to look at the sessions to see what on earth the common theme was in them. And we also had to change all the clusters a little bit to make sure the time zones worked. So we had to have Asia and Europe, or Europe and North America in a cluster. We couldn't really have a mixture of Asia and North America in a cluster. So then we've recruited 2 co-chairs per session to moderate. And my hope is that these mini oral sessions will basically function as panel discussions. So I'm hoping that we have at least a sort of quorum of 6 or 7 authors, 2 co-chairs, and hopefully some interested attendees. And my hope is that somehow we manage to have interesting discussions online. So this is kind of an experiment, and I'll be interested to see how that works over the course of the conference. So that was an overview of the entire review and selection process for MICCAI 2020. And hopefully this has provided you with some useful context for the questions posed by the hackathon. Of course, I'd like to thank a lot of people here. This certainly is a major team sport, setting up a MICCAI conference. So special thanks to Parang, my program co-chair, and Kitty Wong, the platform submissions coordinator. We spent many hours on Zoom together in the last few months, so thank you to them for all their help and for helping me prepare some of these slides. Also, of course, we had an excellent program co-chair team, so Diana, Daniel, Kevin and Maria, and the support of the general chairs, Daniel and Leo. In addition, we have 83 area chairs, 1,500 or so reviewers, and thousands of submitting authors, all of whom are needed to make this conference run. DECON, the professional conference organisers, have also been extremely helpful in setting up the web application forms and with the platform. And finally, I'd like to thank all the preceding programme chairs who've refined the reviewing process over the years, particularly Maxime, Julia and Terry, who've basically brought the reviewing process onto the CMT and refined it over the last couple of years and set up clear operating manuals, lots of documentation and so on, which will hopefully we'll be able to pass on to next year's. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have live at the Zoom session.